Okay, now we're going to start chapter 10 on biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? There are actually different ways of measuring it. So with genetic diversity, you are measuring the variety of different genes within a species. So those of you that have taken biology 1010, you'll remember that you have alleles. They are different versions of the same gene. It's like having blue eyes versus brown eyes. So you can measure how many different versions you have of that particular gene. You can also look at species diversity. This is the number of different kinds of organisms within a community. And ecological diversity measures richness and complexity of a community. So what is richness? Well, it is the total number of species in a community. However, you also have to look at evenness. This is the relative abundance of individuals within each species. It does you no good if you have a whole lot of species and you have 90% of one species and 1% of each of the others. That's not a very even community. If you look at the figure presented here on the left, you have a community that's much more even than the one on the right, even though they both technically have the same level of richness. Now, how do you define a species? Well, typically we use what's called the biological species concept. This is based on the idea of reproductive isolation. Basically, a species is defined as organisms that can interbreed in nature and produce fertile offspring. However, there are other species concepts. One is the phylogenetic species concept. This is actually going to emphasize the branches of a taxonomic tree. So basically, you are looking at evolutionary relationships through time. Then you also have the evolutionary species concept, and you are defining species in terms of evolution and historic terms. So you're not just looking at recent relationships, you're looking at more historical relationships as well. Now, one way that we can look at relationships is using molecular techniques. So by looking at DNA sequences, we can get insight into taxonomic and evolutionary relationships. So basically what we do is you want to sequence the genome of your organism of interest. So the genome is all the DNA that makes up a species. And you can actually get DNA from things like blood, fur, or even feces, which is kind of funny. If you look at a lot of the workers for, say, Louisiana Fish and Wildlife, those that work with deer and black bears, they don't always track animals specifically by following them with radio collars. They actually will collect what's called scat, and scat is the animal poop, and they can actually identify individual animals based on their poop and know which bear or which deer they're actually talking about. And DNA can also provide good insight, again, into looking at evolutionary relationships, who's related to who, but it also allows us to look again at that genetic variation within a population. How much genetic diversity does a population actually have? Well, how many species are there? Currently, we have 1.7 million species that have been identified to date, but there are estimates that this can range anywhere from 3 to 5 to 50 million. Data from the entomologists alone supports the idea that there are 4 to 6 million insect species. Just insects, not talking about any other group. And invertebrates, those are going to be organisms that do not have a backbone but are considered animals, make up 65% of all known species, and there's probably a lot out there we haven't found yet. When you look at biodiversity hotspots, places that have the most biodiversity, in terrestrial ecosystems, that is the rainforest, and in marine ecosystems, those are coral reefs. So if you look at 34 hotspots, they make up 1.4% of land area on the planet, but they contain more than 75% of the world's most threatened mammals, birds, and amphibians. So we have a whole lot of known and endangered species. How many named species do we have in these various groups, and how many of them are actually endangered? If you look, amphibians are really high on that list. Believe it or not, so are gymnosperms. Gymnosperms, that word means naked seed. It refers to pine trees, ginkgo trees, cycads, that group of plants. But amphibians are at risk, and one of the reasons they're so at risk is, remember, they actually absorb oxygen through their moist skin, so they're at risk of any sort of water pollution because it actually gets absorbed as part of their breathing process. And when you look at biodiversity hotspots, they're all around the equator, basically, where you have fairly constant warm temperatures. You have lots of rainfall, lots of sunlight for primary production through photosynthesis. Well, what are some benefits to having a lot of biodiversity? Well, first of all is food. Wild plants provide new sources of food, and they allow us to have more genetic diversity for existing crops. You guys don't know this, but the bananas that we eat now do not taste the same as bananas 30 years ago because it's a different type of banana. And the bananas we eat now are actually at risk of going extinct due to pathogens like the ones 30 years ago did, and they're in the process of breeding new bananas for us to eat. We can also get drugs and medicines from biodiversity hotspots. If you look at more than half of all of our current medicines, they have some product that came from nature. And pharmaceutical companies actively go into tropical countries and examine soil cultures and plant specimens trying to come up with new medications. Unfortunately, resources tend to be extracted without compensation to the government or the local peoples, and this is considered biopiracy. If you actually share profits, it provides an incentive to locals to preserve native species. Now, there are also ecological benefits to biodiversity. Things like soil formation, waste disposal, air and water purification, nutrient cycling, the absorption of sunlight, and biogeochemical processes all depend on biodiversity. We still don't have a complete understanding of how our planet works, especially in biological communities. It may turn out that organisms that seem insignificant to us have a huge impact later on when they're gone. And it's believed that the total value of ecological services provided by the planet is at least $33 trillion per year, or about half the world's total gross national product. There's also aesthetic and cultural benefits. Let's be honest, all of us know people who like to hunt, fish, camp, hike. I personally love going scuba diving, and Americans spend over $700 billion annually on nature-based recreation. We only spend about $81 billion on cars, so ecotourism can actually be an important form of sustainable economic development. Again, it's this idea of the intrinsic value of life, that organisms have value in and of themselves, not just for the services they provide us. Now, extinction is the elimination of a species on the planet. We have natural extinction events. In undisturbed ecosystem, the background rate historically is about one species per decade. Based on the fossil record, more than 99% of all species that ever existed are currently extinct. And periodically, the Earth has experienced mass extinctions. In the Permian period, that extinction event caused 95% of marine species and nearly half of all plant and animal families to die out about 250 million years ago. We had the End Cretaceous event. This is also called the KT extinction. This is actually what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and led to 50% of existing groups on the planet to go extinct. So we had several massive mass extinctions. You had the late Ordovician, the late Devonian, the Permian Triassic, the late Triassic, and the KT, the End Cretaceous extinction. Now, what's interesting is we have another extinction event happening right now, and it's because of humans. So in the last 100 years alone, we have accelerated the extinction rate by 100 to 1,000%. From 1600 to 1850, it's estimated that 2 to 3 species per decade were lost. And if current trends continue, half of all primates, a quarter of all bird species, will go extinct within the next 50 years. This is equivalent to other mass extinctions. There was actually a report out last week that some of my bird friends were talking about loss of bird diversity in the United States alone. And there are human-caused reasons for this reduction. When you look at E.O. Wilson, he summarizes the human threat to wildlife with the idea of HIPPO: habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, population, and overharvesting. So habitat destruction is probably the biggest reason for the current increase in extinction. We are converting forests to farmland to cities. When you look at habitat for wildlife, it's fragmented into small scattered plots. That's a lot of edge, not a lot of core habitat. We also have loss of habitat due to mining, to construction of dams, and we have very destructive fishing practices that destroy the ocean bottom and organisms that live there. Now, habitat fragmentation is when you're reducing habitat into small isolated patches. So this is a problem because by making small patches, when you look at larger predators like bears and like mountain lions, they require large connected territories. So the issue is, as they move from patch to patch, they're more likely to be killed, or they can't survive patch to begin with. If you look at other species like certain birds, they can only reproduce successfully in deep forest. They cannot grow in edge habitat. This also can divide populations into isolated groups, which basically bottlenecks them because they're no longer reproductively connected. So they start to inbreed, and then it makes them more vulnerable to catastrophes because they no longer have genetic diversity. Okay, we're going to pause here, and the next video will pick up with invasive species.